Pam Bondi confronted by woman veteran at press conference. What she does next shocks everyone. Before we move forward, kindly hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell icon to get notifications from us. The room buzzed with the low hum of murmurs as Pam Bondi, former Attorney General of Florida, prepared to address the crowd. The setting was familiar, a well-lit conference room filled with journalists from local and national media outlets. Bondi stood confidently behind the podium, ready to discuss a new veterans initiative that had been in the works for several months. The event was supposed to be routine, a chance for her to deliver a polished speech, highlighting the government's commitment to improving the lives of veterans across the state. But as the reporters settled into their seats, none of them could have predicted the event that was about to unfold. Bondi began speaking, her voice steady and measured. She spoke of new funding programs, healthcare access, and benefits for veterans who had served the country with honor. Her words were designed to inspire confidence in those who had long been frustrated by bureaucratic red tape and slow-moving reforms. "Our veterans deserve the best," she declared, "and we are committed to making sure they receive the care they have earned." As she spoke, several journalists scribbled down notes, and others raised their hands, eager to ask their questions. But before anyone could speak, a voice cut through the air. "What about the veterans who aren't getting any care at all?" the voice asked, sharp and filled with emotion. Bondi froze mid-sentence, her eyes shifting from the papers in front of her to the woman who had stood up at the back of the room. The woman, wearing a worn military jacket and a veteran's hat, was standing, her eyes locked on Bondi's. Her face, lined with the visible scars of age and experience, showed a mixture of frustration and exhaustion. "You talk about your programs and your new policies, but where's the real help for those of us who've been waiting for years?" Her voice was steady, but the words hit like a punch to the gut. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, everyone waiting for Bondi's response. Bondi's mind raced. She had prepared for this moment, at least she thought she had. She had anticipated questions about the specifics of the new policies and possible concerns about funding, but she hadn't expected a direct confrontation. This woman's accusation was raw, personal, and echoed the concerns of countless veterans who felt abandoned by the system. For a brief moment, Bondi considered brushing the woman off, offering a generic reply about the government's progress. But as she looked into the woman's tired eyes, something shifted within her. Bondi paused. She let the silence stretch for a moment, her breath slow and deliberate. The room seemed to hold its breath with her, as though waiting for the next move. In the past, she had often been praised for her quick wit and ability to handle criticism with a firm response. But today, something felt different. Bondi had spent her career in public service, but this moment felt like the true test of her leadership. After a long pause, Bondi took a deep breath and nodded slowly. "I hear you," she said, her voice calm but with a newfound sincerity. "I hear the frustration in your voice, and I know that many veterans feel the same way. This isn't just about numbers and policies, it's about real people, and I won't ignore that." She looked directly at the woman. "I'll meet with you after this press conference. We'll talk about what needs to be done." The words felt genuine, but they were also a risk. Bondi knew that meeting with a veteran one-on-one could be a difficult and emotional conversation, but it was something she had never done before, truly listening to someone's story outside the confines of a scripted meeting or press release. The room remained quiet as Bondi's words settled in the air. The journalists exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of the exchange. Was this a calculated political move, or was Bondi genuinely affected by the woman's words? Bondi's decision to engage with the veteran had thrown off the usual rhythm of press conferences. In an age where politicians rarely showed vulnerability, this moment was different. It was raw, unscripted, and it had just changed the tone of the entire conference. "Thank you for speaking up," Bondi said, her gaze still fixed on the woman. The veteran nodded, her posture slightly softer now, but her eyes remained guarded. As the tension in the room began to dissipate, the reporters slowly started to raise their hands, eager to get back to the planned questions. But the energy had shifted. No longer was this a standard press event about policy, it had transformed into something more personal, a conversation about the real human cost of political decisions. Bondi took a final breath and prepared herself to answer the next question. But in the back of her mind, she couldn't help but wonder if this moment would be remembered not for her speeches or policies, but for the way she had responded to one person's call for change. After the press conference ended, the buzz of journalists' voices filled the room, but Pam Bondi barely registered the conversations around her. Her mind kept returning to the woman who had spoken out, and to the words she had shared. She had expected to go through the motions, answer a few questions, make a few promises. But the woman's accusation had shaken her in a way that nothing else had in recent memory. The woman had left the room shortly after the exchange, her steps heavy but purposeful as she exited the building. Bondi had arranged for the meeting to take place in a small conference room on the far side of the building, away from the media frenzy. She could feel the weight of the upcoming conversation pressing down on her chest as she walked towards the room. When Bondi entered the conference room, she was surprised to find the woman already seated at the table. The veteran's jacket, which had once been pristine, was now faded and frayed at the edges, a visual testament to the many years she had spent in service to her country. She looked up as Bondi entered, her face a mixture of skepticism and guarded expectation. "Thank you for taking the time to meet with me," the woman said, her voice quieter now but still carrying the same force that had interrupted the press conference earlier. Bondi nodded and took a seat across from her, placing her hands on the table, trying to control the fluttering in her chest. "I'm here to listen. I know I can't fix everything in one conversation, but I want to understand what's been going wrong." The veteran took a deep breath, clearly steeling herself before speaking. "It's not just the broken system, Pam. It's the way we're treated. We fought for this country, and we come back to nothing. There are promises made, sure, but when you get home, you see how empty those promises are. I've been to the VA hospitals, waited for months, sometimes years, just to get the care I need. And when I finally get seen, I'm told the system is overloaded. I've heard every excuse in the book." Bondi absorbed the woman's words in silence, her gaze never leaving her. She had read countless reports about the struggles veterans faced, but hearing it firsthand was different, it was personal. She could see the pain and the frustration etched across the veteran's face. There was no denying it now, the system had failed, and this woman, along with thousands of others, had paid the price. "I'm sorry," Bondi said softly. "I know it's not enough, but I'm truly sorry for what you've gone through." The words felt inadequate, but they were the only ones she could offer. The veteran's eyes softened slightly, but the bitterness in her expression didn't fade. "Sorry doesn't change anything. I'm just one voice, but there are thousands of us out there. Do you really understand that? Can you even imagine what it's like to wake up every morning wondering if today will be the day you finally get the help you need, or if you'll spend another night in pain, still waiting?" Bondi hesitated, unsure of how to respond. She had never personally faced the kind of challenges this veteran had endured. She had grown up with every opportunity at her fingertips, never forced to navigate a broken system like the one the woman was describing. And yet, sitting across from her, Bondi couldn't ignore the raw truth in her words. "I can't pretend to know what it's like," Bondi said, her voice steady but empathetic. "But I want to understand. I need to understand what it's like for people like you, who've been through the worst and then come home to a system that doesn't seem to care." The veteran let out a long, slow breath, her fingers drumming lightly against the table. "You want to understand? Start by listening. Really listening, not just to the reports and the stats. Listen to the people who have been waiting for years, those who are falling through the cracks. Listen to those who don't have anyone else to turn to." Bondi felt a pang of guilt. She had spent years in government positions, drafting policies, approving budgets, and signing bills. But had she truly listened to the people they were meant to serve? She had always seen veterans as a part of the political agenda, a box to check, a group to help for the sake of optics. But sitting here now, face to face with someone who had given so much, she realized how wrong she had been. "I will listen," Bondi said, her voice now firm with conviction. "And I will do what I can to make sure this doesn't happen again, to you or to anyone else." The veteran studied her for a long moment, her gaze sharp as she seemed to weigh Bondi's words. Finally, she gave a small nod, though the skepticism never left her eyes. "We'll see if that's true." The tension between them lingered in the air, but something had shifted in that moment. It wasn't a solution, and it certainly wasn't an easy fix. But for the first time, Bondi felt as if she had been handed a clear, undeniable truth. The system wasn't just broken, it was failing people who deserved better. As the meeting ended, the veteran stood, giving Bondi one final glance before walking out of the room. Bondi remained seated for a moment, her mind racing with the weight of everything she had just heard. The questions were now not just about policy or statistics. They were about the lives of real people, like the woman who had just left. This wasn't the kind of thing that could be fixed with a speech or a press release. It would take real, tangible change. And Bondi knew that the road ahead would be long, much longer than she had ever anticipated. But now, for the first time in a long while, she was ready to walk that road. The days following the meeting with the veteran were a blur for Pam Bondi. She had never experienced anything quite like it in her career. The conversation had left a profound impact on her, and as she sat in her office, sifting through papers and reading reports, her mind kept drifting back to the raw emotion in the veteran's eyes. The questions had shifted from policy and budget to something far more personal and troubling. How had the system allowed this to happen? How many more people were out there, waiting and suffering? Bondi had always believed that the programs and initiatives in place were helping veterans. She had seen the statistics, on paper, everything seemed fine. But the veteran had shown her something that couldn't be quantified by numbers, the real, human cost of inaction. For the first time in a long time, Bondi felt uncertain. She had worked tirelessly for the state of Florida, building a career in law and politics, yet here she was, confronted with an issue that didn't have a simple solution. Veterans' healthcare had been an ongoing issue for years, and no amount of policy tweaking seemed to fix the underlying problem. No one had ever made her feel the weight of it the way this veteran had. "Can I help?" Bondi whispered to herself, her voice filled with doubt. She had always believed in her ability to find solutions, to craft legislation that would fix problems. But this was different. This wasn't about introducing a bill or signing a law. This was about changing the way the system operated at its core, something that felt beyond her control. That evening, as she walked to her car, Bondi's phone buzzed. It was an email from her assistant, marked with the subject line, "Request for follow-up on veterans' concerns." She had almost forgotten about the meeting, but the message was a stark reminder of the promises she had made to the woman. The veteran had requested further discussions, asking for specific information about the veterans' benefits programs, along with details on the conditions of care at local VA hospitals. It was a simple request, but one that spoke volumes about the lack of transparency and accountability. Bondi sat in her car, staring at the screen of her phone. There was no easy response to this. She couldn't just throw out a few lines in an email and consider the matter closed. The veteran wanted to know more, wanted evidence that things would actually change. She had made a promise that she would listen and take action. But how could she guarantee that any action she took would make a real difference? The following morning, Bondi sat down with her team to begin addressing the veterans' concerns. She called in several advisors, experts in veterans affairs, as well as a few representatives from local VA hospitals. They gathered around a large conference table, papers and laptops scattered across it, each person preparing to dive into the data. Bondi started the meeting with a frank admission. "We need to face the reality of this situation. It's not enough to sit behind a desk and sign papers. We need to make sure veterans like the one I spoke to are getting the care they deserve." One of her advisors, a veteran himself, spoke up. "The numbers tell one story, but the reality on the ground is different. We have wait lists that stretch for months. Some veterans go without treatment simply because there aren't enough doctors, or the existing systems are overloaded. The VA hospitals aren't just underfunded, they're overwhelmed, and the staff is overworked. It's a culture problem, not just a financial one." Bondi's stomach tightened at the words. She had known the system was flawed, but hearing it so directly, from someone who had lived through it, hit harder than any report ever could. This wasn't just about fixing the numbers or increasing funding, it was about changing a system that had, for too long, failed the people it was supposed to help. She spent hours poring over reports, looking for patterns, checking the progress of ongoing initiatives, and speaking to local officials. The more she looked, the clearer it became, the issues were systemic. Programs that were supposed to assist veterans were bogged down by inefficiency and bureaucracy. Promises had been made, but not enough had been done to ensure that veterans could access the benefits they had earned. By the end of the week, Bondi was no closer to a solution, but she was more determined than ever to find one. She called the veteran who had confronted her at the press conference, her heart racing as she dialed the number. After a few rings, the woman picked up. "Hello? Hi, this is Pam Bondi," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I wanted to follow up on our conversation." There was a pause on the other end, and then the veteran spoke again, this time with less edge in her voice. "I didn't expect you to call." "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Bondi replied, her voice quieter now. "And I've spoken to a lot of people about the concerns you raised. The truth is, I've been digging into the system. Looking at reports, talking to people who are actually working in the hospitals. And it's clear to me that we have a long way to go." The veteran let out a breath, but there was no trace of satisfaction in her tone. "I'm not looking for apologies, Pam. I'm looking for change." Bondi nodded, even though the woman couldn't see her. "I understand that. And I'm not going to promise something I can't deliver overnight. But I want you to know I'm committed to making sure things change. I've already started pushing for more oversight and more accountability, and I'll keep you updated as things progress." There was a long pause on the other end, and for a moment, Bondi wasn't sure if the veteran would respond at all. Finally, the woman spoke, her voice softened but still firm. "We'll see. But don't let it just be words, Pam. We're waiting." Bondi hung up the phone, the weight of the conversation settling deep inside her. She had no easy answers, but the road ahead was now clear. There was work to be done. And she was going to be the one to do it, no matter how long it took. The time for promises had passed. It was time to take real action. Pam Bondi couldn't shake the feeling that every step she took toward fixing the broken veterans system felt like a giant leap into uncharted territory. Despite her career in politics, which had spanned decades, she had never confronted a problem so deeply rooted in systemic failure. The veteran's words echoed in her mind every day, "Don't let it just be words." For days after the phone call, Bondi threw herself into the task. She met with experts, interviewed veterans, and visited local VA facilities. What she uncovered was as frustrating as it was eye-opening. The hospitals were underfunded, the staff was overwhelmed, and the bureaucratic barriers veterans faced to access care were insurmountable. For years, policies had been implemented that merely papered over the cracks in the system without addressing the root cause of the problem. Her team worked tirelessly to compile data, expose the inefficiencies, and examine the specific challenges faced by veterans. But for Bondi, the numbers alone weren't enough. She had been given a direct glimpse into the human toll of these policies, and it was that human element that fueled her growing sense of urgency. She couldn't ignore the faces of the veterans she had met, the woman who had confronted her, yes, but also the others who had approached her afterward, telling their stories of neglect and suffering. One late afternoon, Bondi sat in her office surrounded by folders full of reports, recommendations, and proposals. She sifted through them, her eyes tired but determined. One proposal caught her attention, a bold initiative to overhaul the state's veterans' healthcare system. It called for streamlining the process for veterans to access healthcare, increasing funding for VA hospitals, and instituting a series of checks and balances to ensure better accountability. But as she read through the plan, Bondi hesitated. This was not just a matter of drafting a bill and presenting it to the legislature. It was going to be a fight. There would be opposition. Some would call it too expensive, others would argue it was unnecessary. But deep down, Bondi knew this was the only way to make a real difference. The question was no longer about political strategy, it was about doing the right thing. She picked up the phone and called her assistant. "I need to speak with the governor," she said, her voice steady. "It's time we have a real conversation about veterans' care. I'm ready to take action." Later that week, Bondi found herself in a meeting with the governor and several other key policymakers. She laid out the proposal, emphasizing the urgency of reform and the real human cost of inaction. The room was silent as she spoke, the weight of her words heavy in the air. "The time for small changes is over," she told them, her voice firm. "We need a sweeping reform, something that directly addresses the failings of our system. Veterans are waiting for us to step up. They've waited long enough." There was a moment of hesitation before the governor spoke. "You know this is going to be a difficult sell, Pam. The budget is already tight. And some of the legislators are going to resist." Bondi nodded. She had anticipated this. But she wasn't backing down. "I'm not asking for more time, I'm asking for action. We've been talking about this for years, and the problem is only getting worse. We owe it to the people who served this country to do more than talk." As the meeting continued, Bondi found herself pushing harder than ever. She was relentless, outlining the specifics of her proposal, offering compromises where necessary, but never wavering on the need for fundamental change. Finally, after hours of discussion, the governor agreed to move forward with the initiative. But Bondi knew that this was just the beginning. The real battle would be in the halls of the legislature, where powerful interests often held sway over decisions like these. Over the next few weeks, Bondi worked tirelessly to rally support for the proposal. She met with legislators, veterans advocacy groups, and local leaders, sharing her vision for a new approach to veterans' healthcare. Her campaign was met with both support and resistance. Some lawmakers were moved by her passion and the stories she shared, but others were skeptical, worried about the potential costs and the political ramifications. Bondi knew that the road ahead would be difficult. But each conversation, each meeting, only fueled her determination. The veterans she had met, the ones who had shared their heartbreaking stories with her, were never far from her mind. She knew that they were counting on her, and that weighed heavily on her heart. One night, as she sat in her office reviewing the latest round of feedback on the proposal, her phone rang. It was the woman veteran who had confronted her at the press conference. "Pam?" The voice was familiar, but there was a new tone in it, a hint of hope. "I'm here," Bondi replied, putting down the papers in front of her. "I've been watching what you've been doing," the woman said. "I heard about the proposal, and I just wanted to say, thank you. You're really pushing for change, aren't you?" Bondi smiled, feeling the weight of the conversation she had had with this woman, the one that had started it all. "Yes. Yes, I am. And I'm not stopping until we get it right." For the first time since the press conference, Bondi felt a sense of optimism. She had a long road ahead of her, and there were bound to be setbacks. But the first steps had been taken. The proposal was gaining traction, and people were beginning to listen. The fight for veterans' care wasn't over, but for the first time in years, Bondi felt like real change was within reach. The system was broken, yes, but it could be fixed. And she was going to make sure of it. This wasn't just about politics anymore. It was about something far more important, a promise to the men and women who had given everything for their country. And Pam Bondi wasn't going to let them down. The months that followed were filled with meetings, debates, and sleepless nights as Pam Bondi worked tirelessly to push her proposal forward. The legislative halls of Florida were buzzing with activity. Bondi was no stranger to political opposition, but this time, the stakes felt higher. This wasn't just another policy initiative. This was about changing the very foundation of the state's commitment to veterans. It was a monumental task, but Pam had a fire inside her now, one that couldn't be extinguished. Every meeting, every discussion, was an opportunity to move one step closer to creating a system that could finally deliver on its promises to those who had sacrificed so much. The proposal she had put forward wasn't just a series of policy changes, it was a call to action. It included significant increases in funding for VA hospitals, an overhaul of the bureaucratic systems that had left veterans languishing in waiting rooms, and new programs designed to ensure that veterans were not only heard but actively supported in their reintegration into civilian life. Bondi's vision was ambitious, but it was grounded in the hard truths she had learned over the months since her initial conversation with the woman veteran. As the bill began to gain traction, Bondi's work was far from done. Each week, she met with legislators from both parties, hoping to gain their support. Some were sympathetic to her cause, recognizing the urgent need for reform. But others were more reluctant, questioning the cost and the feasibility of such an overhaul. The opposition was fierce, with some lawmakers arguing that veterans' care was already receiving adequate attention, and others suggesting that the proposal's funding could be better spent elsewhere. Pam was used to the resistance. But this time, the voices of opposition were drowned out by the voices of those who had felt the sting of neglect for far too long. The veterans themselves were speaking out in support of the bill, sharing their stories and showing the legislators exactly why change was necessary. These weren't just abstract statistics anymore. They were real people, standing up and demanding the care and respect they had earned. One particularly powerful moment came when Bondi invited several veterans to testify before the legislature. The room was filled with the hushed anticipation of a session that had already dragged on for hours. When the first veteran stood to speak, the room fell silent. His uniform, though worn, still held the dignity of someone who had served his country with pride. He was older now, his face weathered by time, but the anger and pain in his eyes were unmistakable. "I'm here today because I have waited years for the care I was promised," he began, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I was told that when I returned from war, I would have everything I needed. But instead, I waited. And waited. And still, nothing. I've been through every VA hospital in this state, and let me tell you, the treatment is not what you think it is. It's broken. It's a system that fails us at every turn. You may not hear us, but we are here. And we are asking for change." The veteran's words rang through the room, leaving a profound silence in their wake. For a moment, it seemed as though the entire legislative body was taking in the gravity of his statement. Bondi, sitting at the front of the room, felt the weight of every word. This was no longer just a political issue, it was a moral one. The testimony continued, with several more veterans sharing their harrowing stories of waiting months for a doctor's appointment, or being shuffled between different facilities without ever receiving the proper care. Each story was a punch to the gut, each word a reminder of how far the system had fallen short. Bondi knew that their stories had shifted something in the room. She could see the lawmakers' expressions change. The resistance began to wane, and soon, the vote started to turn in her favor. The proposal, once met with skepticism, now seemed not only necessary but inevitable. Bondi's vision was becoming a reality. As the final vote approached, Bondi stood in front of the podium, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke to the gathered legislators. "This bill is about more than healthcare. It's about restoring trust. It's about telling every veteran, every man and woman who has served this country, that we see them. We hear them. And we will take action to make sure they are not forgotten. I ask you to stand with me, stand with our veterans, and pass this bill." The vote was close, but when the final tally came in, the proposal passed. A wave of relief washed over Bondi. It wasn't just a victory for her. It was a victory for every veteran who had been waiting for too long, hoping for change that never came. In the weeks that followed, the news coverage was filled with reports of the newly passed Veterans Care Bill. The state was now committed to ensuring that veterans received timely and adequate care. And while the battle was far from over, the groundwork had been laid. Bondi knew this was just the beginning. She sat in her office one late evening, reflecting on how much had changed since that fateful press conference when the woman veteran had confronted her. It had started with a simple question, one that had turned her entire perspective upside down. But it had led to something bigger, something that would resonate long after she was gone from office. She had changed the narrative, and in doing so, she had given veterans a voice in a system that had long silenced them. And then, just as she was about to leave for the night, her phone rang. It was the woman veteran. Pam, the voice on the other end said, quieter now, but filled with something else. You did it. I knew you would. Thank you. Bondi smiled, feeling the weight of her journey, and the weight of the responsibility she had taken on. We did it. This is just the beginning. As she hung up the phone, Pam Bondi allowed herself a moment of reflection. The fight for veterans' care was far from over, but with this victory, she had proven one thing: sometimes, all it takes is one voice to start a movement. And that voice had been the one she had heard so many months ago in that press conference. It was a voice she would never forget, and one that would inspire her, and others, for years to come.